before the first snow. There is a silence that belongs only to the deep winter forests of the North American subarctic, a silence so complete, so absolute, that it seems to breathe. It is the silence of spruce trees standing black against a sky so cold it has turned the stars brittle. It is the silence of a frozen lake that holds its secrets beneath 4 feet of ice. It is the silence of a world that has retreated so far from warmth that the very concept of fire seems like a myth told by children. In that silence, the Algonquian peoples, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Innu, the Naskapi, the Abenaki, and their cousins across the northern woodlands, learned to hear things that those of softer climates cannot hear. They heard the creak of timber contracting in extreme cold. They heard the distant howl of wind moving through passes 50 miles away. And sometimes, in the loneliest hours before dawn, when the aurora crackled overhead in curtains of green and violet fire, they heard something else entirely. A footstep. Too large. Too deliberate. Coming from no direction and every direction at once. That sound, that impossible, bone-deep sound, was the beginning of the Wendigo. This is its story, not the Hollywood invention, not the campfire shorthand, but the real and terrible story of a being that emerged from the most extreme conditions human beings have ever been asked to survive. It is a story about hunger, about cold, about the unthinkable things that isolation does to the human mind. It is a story about a monster that was, in the most frightening interpretation of all, never entirely fictional. The land that made the monster. To understand the Wendigo, one must first understand the landscape that gave birth to it. The boreal forest, the taiga, stretches across the northern edge of the North American continent in an unbroken band of dark spruce, jack pine, birch, and aspen. It covers more than 1 billion acres. In winter, it becomes one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Temperatures in the subarctic interior regularly fall to minus 40 degrees Celsius, the temperature at which the Fahrenheit and Celsius scales coincide, and which represents a kind of absolute threshold for unprotected human survival. At such temperatures, exhaled breath freezes before it disperses. Metal becomes brittle. Exposed skin develops frostbite within minutes. And the forest, which in summer is alive with birds, insects, fish, and game, becomes a nearly barren wasteland. The Algonquian peoples who called this landscape home were not merely visitors to it. They were, over thousands of years, shaped by it with the same patient, remorseless precision with which water shapes stone. Their entire material culture, their snowshoes, their toboggans, their birch bark canoes, their techniques for smoking and drying meat, their understanding of which lichens could sustain a starving person and which would kill, represented an accumulated wisdom of survival that was nothing short of extraordinary. And yet, even with all of this knowledge, even with all of this adaptation, there were years when the caribou did not come, when the moose were absent, when the beaver had been trapped out by both indigenous hunters and, later, European fur traders, when the fish retreated beneath ice too thick to break. In those years, people starved. Not the comfortable, metaphorical starvation of a diet. True starvation, the progressive consumption of the body's own reserves, the weakening of muscle, the clouding of thought, the hallucinations that come when the brain has been denied sufficient glucose for too long. Starvation that killed children first, then the elderly, then the adults who had given their shares to others. It was out of this crucible, this terrible, real, yearly possibility of death by hunger in the frozen dark, that the Wendigo was born. What the elders said, the original Wendigo. The word itself is contested in its etymology, as is often the case with words that originate in oral traditions transcribed by outsiders. Across different Algonquian languages and dialects, it appears in various forms: Wetiko in Cree, Windigo or Wendigo in Ojibwe, Wetiko in Plains Cree, Wetiko in some Western dialects. Scholars have proposed several etymological origins. Some argue it derives from a root meaning evil spirit or cannibal. Others suggest a connection to words meaning owl, the great horned owl being associated in many Algonquian traditions with death and the spirit world. Still others have found possible connections to words meaning excess or to consume beyond one's share. Whatever its linguistic origin, the concept was strikingly consistent across an enormous geographic range, from the Great Lakes region in the south to the Hudson Bay watershed in the north, from Labrador in the east to the territories beyond Lake Winnipeg in the west. This consistency speaks to both the antiquity of the belief and the degree to which it addressed a universal and terrible reality. In the traditional accounts gathered by ethnographers from the 19th century onward, accounts filtered through translation and cultural misunderstanding, but retaining their essential contours, the Wendigo was described in remarkably specific terms. It was enormous. Some accounts placed it at 15, 20, even 30 feet tall, though this scale was understood by many to be symbolic rather than literal, a representation of its overwhelming, consuming nature. Other accounts described it as human-sized but supernaturally thin, a walking skeleton with skin pulled drum-tight over prominent bones, its eyes sunken deep into hollow sockets. It was always cold. The Wendigo did not merely inhabit the winter. It was winter in some essential way. Ice formed in its footsteps. Its breath was the blizzard. In some traditions, its heart was literally a block of ice that could only be destroyed by melting. And so, in those traditions, the only way to kill a Wendigo was to pour boiling tallow or hot water into its chest cavity and melt the frozen heart. It was consumed by hunger. Not ordinary hunger, but a hunger that could never be satisfied, a hunger that grew with every feeding rather than diminishing. This is the central, theologically rich aspect of the Wendigo myth. The more it ate, the larger it grew, and the larger it grew, the greater its hunger became. It was hunger as an infinite regress, a self-perpetuating damnation. And most crucially, it had once been human. This is the detail that separates the Wendigo from most other monsters in world mythology. It is not a demon from another realm. It is not a god gone wrong. It is not a creature of some other order of being. It began as a person, typically, in the accounts, a person who had eaten human flesh during a period of extreme starvation. The act of cannibalism, in the Algonquian spiritual framework, did not merely violate a social taboo. It transformed the person who committed it. It invited a spirit of excess and devouring hunger into the body of the cannibal, and that spirit, once invited, could not be expelled. It grew within the person, pushing out whatever remained of their humanity, until what stood where a person had been was something enormous and insatiable and cold. This transformation was not always immediate. In many accounts, it was gradual, and that gradual quality is perhaps the most frightening aspect of the traditional Wendigo. A person might notice, over days or weeks, that they were beginning to crave human flesh even when other food was available. They might become withdrawn, paranoid, hostile to their family members. They might report smelling human flesh as if it were cooking, hearing voices that urged them to feed. And they might, in their lucid moments, be aware of what was happening to them, aware and terrified, begging their loved ones to end it before the transformation was complete. The Algonquian societies had protocols for exactly this situation. Wendigo Psychosis, the monster in the mind. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as anthropologists and ethnographers began systematic documentation of indigenous cultures across North America, they encountered something that initially seemed too strange to be real: documented cases of what can only be called Wendigo Psychosis. These were cases of Algonquian individuals, almost always men, almost always in conditions of extreme starvation, who began to exhibit a specific and consistent constellation of symptoms. They became convinced that they were transforming into Wendigos. They reported irresistible cravings for human flesh, sometimes despite having access to other food. They described the people around them as appearing to be animals or food sources rather than human beings. They became agitated, violent, or alternately catatonic and raving. And in documented cases, not myths, but documented cases with witnesses, some of these individuals killed and ate members of their own families before being stopped. The anthropologist Morton Tyker compiled a study in 1960 examining 70 such cases reported between 1636 and 1948. The cases came from across the Algonquian world, documented by fur traders, missionaries, colonial officials, and indigenous community members themselves. They were remarkably consistent. The setting was almost invariably winter starvation. The subject was almost invariably a man who had already survived or been present during a period when cannibalism had occurred or been considered, and the progression of symptoms followed a recognizable pattern. Whether Wendigo psychosis was a genuine, culturally specific psychological syndrome, what modern psychiatry calls a culture-bound syndrome, or whether these cases represented the intersection of starvation-induced psychosis with a culturally available framework for understanding it, remains debated among scholars. What is not debated is that the cases were real, that the suffering was real, and that the communities affected dealt with them with a consistency and seriousness that reveals how pressing a concern this was in subarctic Algonquian life. And how did communities deal with a person who was showing signs of Wendigo transformation? With a combination of therapeutic intervention and, in extremis, lethal force. The first response was typically spiritual. Shamans, the Midwiwin or medicine persons, depending on the specific culture, would be called to perform ceremonies designed to drive out the Wendigo spirit before it had fully taken hold. Sweat lodge ceremonies, Healing songs, the use of specific medicines, and extended prayer were all deployed. Family members would sit with the afflicted person through the night, talking to them, reminding them of their identity, their relationships, their obligations to the living world. If these measures failed, if the person was deemed beyond spiritual intervention and represented an imminent physical danger to the community, the decision might be made to kill them. This was not undertaken lightly, and it carried its own spiritual weight. The killer might themselves be at risk of Wendigo contamination. But it was recognized as necessary. The historical record contains documented instances of this occurring, of family members, with enormous grief, killing and often burning the body of a relative who had become, or was believed to be becoming, a Wendigo. The burning was important. The Wendigo's corrupted essence had to be completely destroyed, not buried where it might spread. The most famous of these documented cases is that of Swift Runner, a Cree trapper who was hanged by Canadian authorities in 1879 for the murder and cannibalism of his wife and 5 children during the winter of 1878-79. Swift Runner claimed at his trial that a Wendigo spirit had possessed him and driven him to commit the acts. He had consumed his family despite being, by accounts, only a half-day's walk from a Hudson's Bay Company trading post where food was available. This detail, the availability of other food, is what makes the case so disturbing, and what has kept it at the center of discussions about Wendigo psychosis ever since. Swift Runner was the first person to be executed by the Northwest Mounted Police. His case was treated by Canadian authorities as simple criminality, but it was understood by the Cree communities who knew him in a very different register. The Wendigo appears, a night in the forest. The following section is a literary reconstruction, based on documented accounts, of what an encounter with a suspected Wendigo might have looked and felt like to a subarctic Algonquian community in the 18th century. All events are composite, drawn from multiple historical and ethnographic sources. The winter of 1743 was the worst in living memory across the territory between the Albany River and the shores of Lake Nipigon. The elders could not remember a season when the cold had come so early and stayed so long. By the time the moon of freezing over had passed, the beaver ponds were sealed under ice too thick to break with the tools available, and the caribou herds that should have moved through the valley had gone. Where? No one could say. Perhaps further east. Perhaps further into some winter the animals sensed but the people could not yet see. The band of 23 people, 8 adults, 7 adolescents, 8 small children, had retreated to their winter camp in a sheltered valley where a creek, if it ever thawed, would bring fish. It had not thawed. The spruce boughs they had piled over their lodges kept out the worst of the wind, but not the cold. At night, the temperature dropped to the kind of degrees that made the trees crack and groan in the darkness. Sudden explosive reports like rifle shots that startled everyone awake, hearts hammering. They had been on half rations for 3 weeks. The dried moose meat and pemmican that should have carried them through to the goose moon were running out faster than anticipated, because there were more mouths than there was food, and because a man named Ashkor had not come back from a solo hunting trip 17 days ago. They found Ashkor's camp 6 days into the search. Or rather, they found what remained of it. There had been 2 men at that camp, Ashkor and his brother-in-law, a young man named Pijator who had gone to help with the hunting. The camp showed signs of a fire that had burned for days, the wood supply nearly exhausted. There were tracks in the old snow, preserved by the freeze, that told a story no one wanted to read. Signs of a struggle. And then, in the cold ashes of the fire, things that should not have been there. Ashkor came back to camp 3 days later. He came in the night, which was not unusual. Hunters sometimes traveled after dark to make use of moonlight on open ground. What was unusual was the way he moved. He came to the edge of the camp and stood there in the dark for a long time before anyone became aware of him. The dogs, which should have barked, did not. The dogs pressed themselves flat against the ground and whimpered. He had lost weight that was impossible to lose in 17 days without starving entirely to death. His cheekbones pressed out against skin gone the color of birch bark. His eyes had retreated into his skull, and when the firelight reached them they reflected it back in a way that made the older women pull their children closer without quite knowing why they did so. He did not speak for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. It was still recognizably his voice, but there was something behind it, something in the lower register, something that did not belong to a man. He said, very quietly, "I am so hungry." He did not ask about Pijator. He did not mention Pijator at all. The headman, a man named Makwa whose judgment was trusted, met Ashkor's eyes across the fire and felt something in his chest go tight and cold. He had heard about this. Every elder had heard about this. He had never expected to see it, had hoped, in the way that people hope against terrible things, that he would never have to make the decision that he could already feel forming behind his breastbone. He told his wife, quietly, to take the children to her sister's lodge. He told the two strongest young men in the camp, with a look rather than words, to get their hatchets and stand near the fire without appearing to stand near the fire. Then he asked Ashkor to sit down and eat, and while Ashkor ate, quickly, ravenously, more than his body should have been able to hold, he watched the man's hands, and the man's eyes, and waited. He sent someone to fetch old Nakamis, the medicine woman, because whatever happened next would require her. Nakamis came and sat across from Ashkor, and she sang, not loudly, but steadily, the healing song she knew for cases like this, the one her own grandmother had taught her with the injunction, "You will need this, child, do not let it be forgotten." She burned tobacco. She prayed in the old way to the spirit of the forest, asking it to reclaim what had left the proper order of things. Ashkor listened to the singing and something moved in his face, something that was almost like the man he had been, looking out through the eyes of whatever he was becoming. For a moment, just a moment, those eyes were wet. "I didn't want to," he said. And he did not say what he meant, but everyone there understood. "I know," said Nakamis. "I know, my son. What did it feel like when it came into you?" He thought for a long time. "Like putting on a coat that was too large," he said finally. "Like the coat was wearing me instead of me wearing the coat. And I was very cold, and the coat was warm." Nakamis sang through the night. The young men with the hatchets stayed where they were. Makwa did not sleep. By the hour before dawn, the hour the Ojibwe call the time when the spirits retreat before the coming of light, Ashkor began to shake. He shook for a long time, rocking back and forth, making sounds that were not quite words in any language. Nakamis continued singing. She fed the tobacco fire. She called on everything she knew. And then, very slowly, Ashkor lay down on his side in the snow beside the fire, and pulled his knees to his chest, and began to weep, quietly, brokenly, in the way of a man weeping not for what he had done but for what he had almost become. Nakamis said a final prayer. She looked at Makwa across the body of the man who was still, for the moment, a man. "I cannot promise," she said, "that it will not come back." "I know," said Makwa. Ashkor survived that winter, but he was never again quite what he had been. In the years that followed, he lived at the edge of every camp rather than its center, and people treated him with a complicated mixture of compassion and wariness that he seemed to understand and accept. He never again hunted with a partner. He ate alone. He lived to be an old man. But on the nights when the cold was at its worst and the trees cracked in the darkness, he would stand at the door of whatever lodge he inhabited and face the forest with an expression that no one who saw it ever forgot, and that no one ever asked him to explain. The Europeans arrive, and the Wendigo grows. When European explorers, missionaries, and fur traders began penetrating the subarctic in the 17th century, they encountered the Wendigo legend with reactions that ranged from dismissive contempt to genuine, documented terror. The Jesuit missionaries who pushed deepest into Algonquian territory were, almost uniformly, dismissive. Their records, the famous Jesuit Relations, published annually in France between 1632 and 1673, contain numerous references to what the missionaries called the diabolical superstitions of indigenous peoples, including occasional references to a cannibal spirit of the north. Father Paul Lejeune, writing from his winter among the Montagnais, Innu, in 1634, noted the practice of what he called fear of the Manitou of hunger without understanding the Wendigo specifically, but describing behaviors, the careful sharing of all food, the social prohibition on gluttony, the watchfulness over those who seemed to be losing their minds in winter, that made perfect sense in the context of Wendigo belief. The fur traders understood better, because the fur traders depended on their Algonquian partners for their lives and could not afford the luxury of dismissal. The journals of Hudson's Bay Company factors and Northwest Company traders are full of references to Wendigos, sometimes skeptical, more often matter-of-fact. These were practical men who spent winters in conditions as harsh as those their indigenous partners survived, and they did not take winter madness lightly. Among the most detailed early accounts is that of David Thompson, the great surveyor and geographer who traveled extensively through the Northwest in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Thompson documented multiple instances of what he described as the cannibalism madness and noted, with the precision of a man trained to observe, that the afflicted individuals consistently described their own symptoms in terms of the Wendigo belief system, that they did not simply become violent or deranged, but that they narrated their own deterioration in culturally specific ways. Thompson was not certain whether the Wendigo was a real spiritual force or a delusion produced by starvation and isolation. But he was absolutely certain that the suffering was real, and he treated those who claimed to be afflicted with serious concern rather than dismissal. The fur trade itself, it must be noted, contributed significantly to the conditions that produced Wendigo cases. The HBC and NWC had both engaged, from the earliest days of the trade, in practices that disrupted the traditional resource management of Algonquian peoples. Beaver, the cornerstone of the fur trade, was trapped at unsustainable rates, collapsing local populations that had previously been carefully managed under indigenous conservation practices. The result, across wide areas of the subarctic, was the same: less food, more starvation, more of the conditions that had always produced the worst winters. The Colonial project, in this sense, was a Wendigo factory. The Wendigo in text, from folklore to literature. The transformation of the Wendigo from a living, culturally embedded belief into a literary and cultural artifact began in the late 19th century, and it is a transformation freighted with the complexities and often the failures of the Euro-American engagement with Indigenous culture. The first significant literary treatment of the Wendigo by a non-Indigenous author came in 1907, with Algernon Blackwood's extraordinary short story simply titled The Wendigo. Blackwood was a British author of supernatural fiction who had spent time in the Canadian wilderness, and his story draws directly on the folklore he encountered there. His Wendigo is a magnificent and terrible thing, a being of wind and height and vertiginous, impossible speed, something that lifts a man from the earth and carries him at supernatural velocity across the treetops until his feet are burned off by the friction of the rushing air. Blackwood's genius was to make his Wendigo less a monster than an experience, something that overcomes a man the way a religious vision overcomes a mystic, unwanted and unstoppable and utterly transforming. His story is about wilderness itself as a kind of horror, about the insufficiency of the rational European mind when confronted with the vast, indifferent intelligence of the northern forest. It remains one of the finest pieces of supernatural fiction in the English language, and it introduced the Wendigo to the broader reading public in a way that has echoed through a century of subsequent literature. After Blackwood, the Wendigo became fair game for popular culture, and not always fair in its treatment. The creature was stripped of its cultural specificity, its psychological richness, its theological depth, and transformed into a simple monster, big, scary, associated with cannibalism in a way that was titillating rather than tragic. By the late 20th century, it had become a staple of horror films, role-playing games, and genre fiction, appearing so frequently and in such varied and often inaccurate forms that the original Algonquian concept had been almost completely buried. Indigenous scholars and community members have, over the past several decades, been vocal about this appropriation and the damage it does. The Wendigo, they argue, is not simply a cool monster to be borrowed for entertainment. It is a living part of a belief system that continues to have meaning for Algonquian communities. It encodes crucial knowledge about survival, about the dangers of excess and selfishness, about the social obligations that keep communities alive in conditions of scarcity. Reducing it to a film antagonist or a tabletop game villain is not merely artistically lazy. It is a form of cultural violence that strips living knowledge from the communities that created and maintained it. This critique is not an argument against all engagement with Wendigo mythology by non-Indigenous creators. Blackwood's story, for all that it is the work of a British outsider, treated the phenomenon with genuine respect and produced genuine art. The question is one of intention, care, and awareness, whether the creator has done the work of understanding what they are drawing on, and whether their treatment honors or demeans the original. The Wendigo as philosophy, Wetiko and the predatory mind. In the 21st century, the Wendigo has acquired a new dimension of cultural relevance through the work of thinkers, primarily Indigenous, but increasingly interdisciplinary, who have found in the Wetiko concept a startlingly apt lens for examining the pathologies of modern capitalist civilization. The scholar and author Jack D. Forbes, a Powhatan Lenape historian, introduced this frame most comprehensively in his 1978 book Columbus and Other Cannibals, which argued that the European conquest of the Americas was itself a manifestation of a Wetiko mentality, a psychic disease characterized by insatiable greed, the consumption of others for one's own benefit, and the inability to recognize the humanity of those being consumed. Forbes argued that the Wetiko disease, far from being a rare and tragic aberration, was in fact the organizing principle of colonial capitalism, the corporation as Wendigo, the market as the great devouring hunger that grows with every feeding. This frame has been developed further by writers including Paul Levi, whose book Dispelling Wetiko examines the concept in terms of Jungian psychology and collective shadow, and by numerous Indigenous scholars who have applied the Wetiko lens to contemporary issues including environmental destruction, extractive industry, and the opioid crisis. The argument is disarmingly simple in its basic form. The Wendigo, in the original Algonquian understanding, is a being that cannot stop consuming even when consumption destroys it. It eats until there is nothing left to eat, and then it starves, and it is the devouring, not the starvation, that is the point. What is industrial civilization? This argument asks, if not precisely this. An economic system that consumes natural resources at unsustainable rates, that grows in its appetite the more it consumes, that cannot integrate the concept of enough into its fundamental operating logic? The Wendigo, in this reading, is not a being from a winter forest in subarctic. It is the spirit of the age. It is the psychic whether we all live under. And the question posed by the original Algonquian understanding, the question of how communities protect themselves from the consuming hunger of those who have lost their humanity, is not merely a historical anthropological curiosity. It is the central question of the 21st century. The body of the monster, what the Wendigo looks like. In the dreams of those who have studied it too closely, the Wendigo looks like this. It stands at the edge of the tree line, in the hour between midnight and dawn, when the cold is at its most absolute and the silence has become something with weight and texture. It is tall, tall enough that its head is level with the lower branches of the spruce trees, which are 40 feet up. But it is not massive in the way of a bear or a moose. It is massive in the way of something that has been stretched, that has grown upward in all the wrong proportions while the flesh diminished to almost nothing. It is thin. Pathologically, monstrously thin, a skeleton draped in skin, every rib visible, the clavicles pressing out like wings about to tear through the surface, the hips articulated with terrible precision beneath skin the grey-white of very old snow. Its hands are disproportionately large, the fingers too long, the nails blackened and curved like the horns of something else entirely. Its face is the worst of it. The face is a skull almost, the eyes deeply recessed into the orbital socket so that they should be invisible, but they are not invisible because they glow with a cold phosphorescence, pale blue-white, the color of ice in deep shadow. The mouth is too wide and the lips have been pulled back, not in a grin but in a permanent, involuntary rictus of hunger. The teeth are visible and they are the teeth of something that has been eating bark and bone and things that should not be eaten. It does not move quickly. It does not need to. The forest belongs to it, and the cold belongs to it, and the darkness belongs to it, and there is nowhere to go that it will not be waiting. When it breathes, and it does breathe, in long, slow exhalations that hang in the air as clouds of frozen vapor, the vapor smells of something that has been very cold for a very long time. Not death exactly. Something older than death. Something that was there before life was, and will be thereafter. It is hungry. It is always hungry. It looks at you the way starvation looks at a person who has food, not with malice, exactly, but with a need so absolute that malice would be beside the point. You are not its enemy. You are its answer, however briefly. In the old stories, the ones told to children in winter camps when the cold was loudest and the fire was lowest, the elders would pause at this point in the telling and look into each face around the fire. They would say, "This is why we share. This is why no one eats alone while another goes hungry. This is why we are careful with what we take and careful with what we leave. Because the Wendigo comes for those who forget that the world is not only theirs. Because the Wendigo is what we become when we forget. The last Wendigo, a myth for the present. There is a story told among some Cree communities, a story that is not old, or not entirely old, because it keeps being updated with each generation that tells it, about the last Wendigo. In this story, the Wendigo that stalks the modern world is not the straightforward cannibalistic spirit of the winter forest. It is something more subtle and therefore more dangerous. It wears human clothes. It carries a briefcase, or a portfolio, or a contract with many clauses. It speaks in the language of quarterly earnings and shareholder value and sustainable growth, and every word it speaks contains the same hunger, the same insatiable, self-perpetuating, devouring hunger, as the thing that stood at the tree line in 1743 and waited for Ashkor to lose himself. This modern Wendigo does not eat human flesh, not directly, not visibly, but it eats human futures. It eats the fish from rivers it has poisoned and calls the poisoning an acceptable externality. It eats the arable land and calls the desert it leaves behind an unfortunate side effect of progress. It eats the languages of peoples who knew how to live in a forest for 10,000 years, and it calls the silence that follows cultural evolution. And it is always hungry. It is always hungry because it has a block of ice where its heart used to be, and no matter how much it consumes, the cold at its center does not diminish. The old medicine people knew how to handle a Wendigo. They sang to it, first. They tried to reach whatever remained of the human being inside the consuming thing. And if the singing failed, If the human being was truly gone, they ended it, cleanly, and burned what remained, and said the prayers for those lost to the worst winter. The question that the modern version of this old story asks is, who is singing? Who is singing to the Wendigo of the present age, trying to reach whatever human warmth may remain inside the consuming machine? And who, if the singing fails, has the courage to do what must be done? These are not comfortable questions. They were never meant to be comfortable. The Wendigo was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to keep people awake on the coldest nights, pressing together for warmth, sharing what they had, refusing the logic of every man for himself, because the people who had lived for 10,000 years in the subarctic knew what every man for himself looked like. It looked like a thing that was no longer a man, standing at the edge of the dark, so hungry it had forgotten what it was to be full, calling out in a voice that still sounded, terribly, almost human. The hunger that remains. Winter comes every year to the boreal forest, as it always has. The spruce trees stand black against skies that have returned to their ancient cold. The aurora performs its silent fire above. The lakes seal themselves under ice, and beneath the ice, in the lightless cold water, the fish move slowly, waiting. The Algonquian peoples who gave us the Wendigo, who are still here, still living in relationship with these landscapes despite every effort of colonialism to sever that relationship, carry this story with them still. It is not a quaint antique. It is a living teaching, a map of the human psyche under extreme pressure, a warning about what happens when the coarse social compact, you share, I share, we survive together, breaks down. The monster is real. Whether it manifests as a skeletal giant in a winter forest, or as the quiet madness that descends on an isolated man when survival seems to demand the unthinkable, or as the larger, structural hunger of systems built on consuming without limit, it is real. It has always been real. The only protection against it, this is what the stories have always said, is the same protection that kept small bands of human beings alive through the most brutal winters the continent could produce. Turn to the person beside you. Give them what you can afford to give. Accept what they can afford to give you. Build the kind of trust that means no one eats alone when another is hungry. The Wendigo grows in isolation. It grows in hoarding. It grows in the conviction that what is mine and what is yours might also be mine if I am strong enough to take it. It shrinks in community. It shrinks in generosity. It shrinks in the small, ordinary, difficult act of remembering that the person next to you is a person, not a resource, not competition, not prey. The old stories knew this. They encoded it in the worst monster they could imagine, so that the lesson would be impossible to forget. We have forgotten it anyway, more times than can be counted. And the forest is always watching, and the cold is always patient, and somewhere at the edge of the tree line, in the place where the firelight fails, something tall and thin and impossibly hungry is waiting to remind us. It is always waiting. It is never not hungry. And it was, once, like us.